Okay, Tomer, for those who are watching here or on Zoom who haven't had the chance to read or engage with the ideas in your book, before I start with some responses and some of my thoughts, can you summarize all of your years of work in just a few minutes of sharing your argument?
With pleasure. First, maybe we'll mention the name of the book. The name
that's a great idea. Let's do that.
In God's Image, How Western Civilization Was Shaped by a Revolutionary Idea. The idea, of course, is in God's image, is the idea that all humans were created in the image of God. And what I try to show is the seminal place this idea holds in the history of the West, in the establishment of many of the social institutions which we hold very dear today: equality between all people, rights discourse, the liberal order, individualism, and even secularism, which I try to show also stems from the same really specific sort of individualism that the West exhibits. And when I began to research this subject, I was actually very surprised that no one has already written this book, since we're talking about chapter 1 in Genesis, and a very fundamental idea, which I assumed somebody must have summed up how this idea acted and participated in the cultural evolution of the West, but it hasn't been done, so I did it, and that's it. And it was out in Yediot Achronot in Hebrew, I think 4 years ago, and now it's out by NYU Press. It's I forgot the nice Yiddish expression which means translated and improved, like
Überverbessert und verputzt.
Yeah, which it really is, right? It's translation, and it's also it's expanded and improved. This is an academic press, and so I'm very happy about it.
Wonderful. So when I was reading the book in preparation for this evening, one of my daughters saw it sitting on the kitchen table, and she saw the image, and she saw the title, and she said to me, "This looks like a book from Tikva." And I imagine you've gotten that response from people. If you talk about a transformative idea shaping Western civilization, and it's idea that derives from the Bible, I think people assume that this is a project with a certain kind of politics. So I'm curious to know both if you've encountered that assumption, to what extent you actively cultivated or courted that assumption with the subtitle and the image, and then we can talk more about why this book is not, in fact, exactly the book that my daughter thought it was.
What is the subtitle?
How the West was shaped by a revolutionary idea.
Okay. Right, the whole idea of Western civilization being shaped by an idea that's of biblical derivation, the idea of being created in the image of God. Sounds like it's one of these, there were great old days of Western Civ until we went astray in the universities sometime in the 1960s, but we're going to put everything to rights.
I mean, look, I first of all, I admit there is something to it. In a certain way, this book can lend itself into a Tikva-esque interpretation of what we just said, how the Bible influenced it. But it's true, and I mean, I stand by my conclusions in the book, and even more, I will say, the book also presents another answer to that very interesting but scandalous question: why the West? Why has the West become hegemonic in modernity? What's so special about it, right? So this is, in a way, another answer to that, right? There is this sort of idea which constructs or establishes a sort of individualism that is specifically Western, concerned about autonomy, concerned about different dimensions, which we call rights, right? And this is something that developed in the West, and it has certain influence and certain results in the culture, of course, not without their corresponding price, or it's not, nothing is perfect, and of course these phenomena also have the what we pay for them, but I mean, yes, it again, it can lend itself that way, and I would even say it can even be picked up, though it's an academic work, and I'm not trying to pander to any specific audience or worldview. It can also be picked up by some Christian, how do you say, sort of, I forgot the word. Anyway, those who would want to prop up Christianity as some
Apologists?
let's say, okay. It can also be used that way, yeah. But again, I stand by my conclusion.
Well, I didn't experience the book that way because it's not actually an argument for a single trans-historical idea that operates the same way across space and time. It's actually a very interesting argument about how this one idea about humanity having been created in the image of God means different things in different times, places, and cultural contexts. So it is an idea, but it's also an idea that manifests in very different ways. So in the ancient Near East, the idea of man being created in the image of God might actually have meant that man's physical self is the image of God. Mm-hmm. And in the Enlightenment, that might have been that our capacity to reason is that which creates us in the image of God, which are actually two different ideas filtered through the single idea or funneled through the single idea that man is created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the different ideas contained within the one idea, or the different ways that the understanding of man having been created in the image of God, how that's played out differently in different historic periods, because that, I think, to me is a very interesting question of it's both the same idea and it's not the same idea.
I mean, this really is endless, that the number of interpretations of what exactly do we mean when we say image of God. What is that? And as you said, it can be the simple physical form, the contours of our body, which are simply resembling the body of God, which also you can find evidence for this in the Bible, also in the Talmud. Not Yair Loverboim, but which Loverboim wrote a very... No, so not Menachem, Yair Loverboim. Yes, thank you. Wrote a fantastic book about it called Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, which shows very nicely how Chazal, this is just the view of Chazal. And it can be, and then Christianity takes this idea, adopts it. With Paul, it's something that has become fallen within us, and we need to rectify it, we need to resurrect it, as it were, with Christ. Then it can be reason, as you said, it can be conscience, it can be the soul, it can be our will, right? And any of these options allow it to be influential in different ways in Western history. I mean, we were just, still just didn't remember that I didn't even know that you made your PhD in the history of science.
Yeah, we're going to get to that soon. We're going to get to my scientific revolution.
Because I of course write about it, and you could see, I mean, within the scientific revolution, or how scientific method began to be articulated and used, the image of God was also fundamental there in different ways. So you could be a René Descartes, right, that would think that the image of God allows us a reason that can allows us sort of this godly reason that can figure everything out. And so he was this rationalist that didn't need any empirical proof in order to say anything about everything, right? We investigate ourselves and we know what needs to be known. And you can be more Protestant pioneers of science, which thought reason or the image of God was itself also corrupted, and so we can use it, but we can't totally rely on it, and that is exactly why we need experimental and empirical proof. And so they developed more that way of understanding our world, right? This is just a small example how the same concept, even within Christianity, can lead to different to different ways of developing, in this case, scientific method.
So let me ask the big pushback question, which is the following. If the image of God is a really important idea, but it has meant different things to different people at different times, and if it has been deployed even at the same time by different people to mean different things and to support their project in different ways, then maybe the image of God as an idea doesn't really have any explanatory power about anything. Maybe it's just different people in different societies at different times doing the thing they do and adducing this as evidence, by which they mean precisely exactly whatever I would like it to mean right now to prove that I am as ever right about everything.
That's a nice point. But I will retort and say it definitely always means that there is something very precious, eternal, significant within each and every one of us. It definitely always means that our essence is divine or semi-divine, and it is mutual to all of us. And indeed, it is the equal part of, or it is in each of us, there is an equal part of God. So in essence, there is something egalitarian about it. It always means that each and every one of us is significant. Our lives are precious. So it does carry, even if you interpret it as reason or as conscious or whatever, it does carry these qualities that again make us treat people, humans, in a way that were it not for this idea, they would be treated differently. And it makes us also treat ourselves differently. It again creates a sort of individualism and a sort of emphasis on autonomy that I would argue would not develop without it.
It's very interesting, of course, to credit to a religious idea the development of individualism and autonomy, because I think it's certainly much more common today to think of religious people as operating in collectives where they sacrifice some of their individualism and autonomy, and to think of individualism and autonomy, respect for each individual, to be born of a secular humanist approach to thinking about people and ideas, which in fact you explore maybe the extent to which even that emerges from a religious idea. To what extent, and obviously, although we're talking now about a contemporary understanding that exists about religious people and their sacrifice of their individuality to the collective, it certainly is the case that even whatever the power of the idea of being created in the image of God, in eras past, religious people too were subject to various kinds of collectivity and not. What is the interplay within, let's talk about both the interplay within religious communities of this idea of being created in the image of God, giving you individual distinctiveness and value with the sense of being subsumed into some collective, and then also the emergence of the secular idea of individuals and individual human rights and how that relates to this idea.
So first of all, I'm always a bit entertained by people who are surprised that something came out of religious traditions, and because really, I mean, 200, 300 years ago, everything was religion. So I mean, it had to come out of it in a certain way. But these same people will say, oh, but secularism and humanism and democracy and liberalism, they came as a rebellion against tradition, etc. And that is itself true in many ways. But again, I will say, where did this rebellious spirit come from? And again, I think that it is a specific characteristic spirit that has its origin in the Bible, and that was picked up also by Christianity in its way. I mean, we're talking about the story of the Garden of Eden as the first rebellion, isn't it? Right? That's what, I mean, that story teaches us that we become fully human when we rebel. Where Adam, compliant and submissive to God, we would have stayed in the Garden of Eden and not become human. So it's ingrained in our tradition, and we know we can bring many examples. Abraham talking to God about Sodom, etc., etc., and of course, all of Christianity is a sort of rebellion against the divine law that the Hebrews kept, saying we actually don't need all this, etc. So this idea of autonomous individualism had its roots already there, continues to develop, and as I try to show in my book, indeed, secularism itself comes from this same spirit. Because if you lay so much emphasis on the individual human having their autonomy, having their reason which they can use in order to figure out themselves and the world, having rights, meaning different dimensions or depth that are sacred, that need to be kept protected from the king or from whoever. All this can develop and does develop into the liberal order, but it can develop and does develop into also secularism, because that same individual who cherishes their autonomy and who will not accept any government or authority to tell them certain things that they think they are entitled to express the way they want, will also not let God do that. At a certain point, people will say, in order for me to keep my autonomy and indeed to keep my dignity as fully human, I need to reject this superior father figure or boss or king, which endangers my image of God, which of course at that point I will not call my image of God, but this depth within me that I need to keep free and autonomous, etc. So it's really the same tradition.
I want to go back for a couple of minutes in this vein, the way in which secularizing forces can emerge from within a religious tradition, but actually not necessarily as rebellions against that tradition, but as expressions of that tradition. And go back to some of what you write about the scientific revolution, where you try to put paid to the notion of the scientific revolution as a secular rebellion against the religious spirit or against the study of or the understanding of God. And yes, this is definitely a point of personal privilege as somebody who has a lot of interest in this particular part of the argument.
Yeah, so, I mean, wait, could you phrase this as a question?
What is the debunking, if you will, that you do about a kind of standard narrative of the scientific revolution that you argue against? How's that?
I mean, I argue against this envisioning of the Enlightenment in general as a sort of burst of secular reason out of the dark ages of tradition, right? I mean, this is wrong in so many ways. First of all, that the very people who were the first philosophers of the Enlightenment were not secular. I mean, they were not atheists, and sometimes were very, very religious people. But again, also, they used these same arguments which we are talking about in order to assert the ideas that they wanted to forward, right? Specific with the scientific revolution, and I mean, again, for these people, the knowledge of the discovery of the world was the discovery of God. For them, to learn about creation was to learn about the Creator. And they explicitly said so, right? So the beginning of the scientific revolution was when, for many people, reading the book of nature was a complementary or was something that complements reading the Holy Scripture and teaches us more about God. So really, in every way, we're talking about the scientific revolution as something that comes out of the religious tradition and is part of the religious tradition.
One of the things that I found so interesting about the book, and this relates to what you were just talking about, the conception that we might have today, that the study of science is about rejecting religious tradition and instead I will study science. But for people in the 17th century, it might very much have been out of reverence for the creator. I will attempt to understand the creator's world, right? Isaac Newton was a very religious individual in odd ways, but he was a very religious individual. And that it's not just that events, technologies were different in the past, we all know, but ways of thinking about or engaging the world were not the same as they are now. And in a book about ideas, one of the things you're going to have to talk about is the ways in which people's ideas or conceptions of the world are different than we might have them. So that, early in the book, when you talk about what it means to have an understanding that when you are courageous, that is because God came into you and made you courageous. Or when you are depressed, it is because God came into you and made you depressed, which is a pretty different understanding to how we relate to both our feelings and the divine than we have now. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the book is the way that it traces not only the changing of this particular idea, but almost the changing of the mental furniture with which human beings are interacting with this idea.
Yeah. You were relating to the beginning of the book where I try to give the reader an understanding what it means not to be an individual. Because the book is really about, not really about, but one way to describe the book is the development of Western individualism. But what does it mean not to be an individual? What does it mean for how do you live not as an individual? This is something that is totally foreign to us, of course. And what I show, one aspect of it, is that in antiquity, people didn't think of themselves as enclosed centers of reason and consciousness, as these sort of boxed in conscious beings that are looking to the world out of these two windows and acting, as it were, inside the world. They thought of themselves as opened up to the world. There was no real, we can say there was no real line of division between what today we call subjective and objective reality. And so you can see this in how they relate to the gods, right? Especially you can read it very clearly in Greek mythology, in the Odyssey, in the Iliad, right? People ask the gods to instill within them certain characteristics, bravery or love, right? Plant in my chest the bravery so I will be able to act in battle as I should, right? And we can read this also in Hebrew texts. I bring what is called in Hebrew Tzavat HaShvatim. It's an apocryphal text from the first centuries BC about, as it were, about the tzava, how do you say the last will of the different tribe, the different patriarchs of each tribe. And they there talk about how they have different qualities inside them that they need to figure out, like lust and envy, etc., that God can take out of them or put in them, etc. This later develops, of course, into the Yetzer Hara, etc. So all of this is not something that we today understand as because we have developed a conception of individualism which simply buffers out the world and is totally inhibits totally a subjective reality. But that simply wasn't the case in antiquity, and that develops right with the development of Western civilization.
Let's move much closer to the modern era, to the contemporary. When we would think about notions of human rights and the inherent value of each individual, very much as being secular ideas, ideas that emerge from secular ways of being and of thinking about the world. And obviously you connect these ideas in their emergence to the idea of people being created in the divine image. So can you talk about that evolution or transition or emergence of a modern human rights discourse from the idea of being created in the image of God?
So the question of where did we get human rights is such a popular question, and like really hundreds of books were written on this subject, and many of them say this was a secular invention that wanted to rectify or, or like develop some discourse through which we can protect our valuable qualities, right? But what I try to show, and of course I'm not inventing anything now because this is also a very prominent opinion within this research, is that rights developed out of religious tradition, specifically within the church in the 13th century and onward. I bring a text in the book of a pope, the Pope Innocent IV, dying, if I'm not mistaken, in 1254. And he writes in his interpretation to Genesis, to the image of God, he writes, we need to figure out, we need to understand that actually all humans, even infidels, even heretics, have property and governance and legislation as something that we can't interfere with. We need to understand that even us, the church and the Pope, cannot withhold or intervene with people's property and government, right? Really, what he's talking about is, of course, rights. He doesn't use the word, right? But he's talking about sacred areas within others, not only Christians, of course we respect Christians, right? But even others, universally, which we must respect. And this discourse comes out of to put it in very simple terms, a merging of the idea of the image of God as reason, and for the people of the 13th century, by the way, Rambam included, reason, which was the image of God, was also the ability to discern between good and evil and to make the right choice. And the idea of rights, which in the 13th century got a formal conceptualized a description or reality within the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, signed in England in 1215, right, has rights. It has rights, but these are not equal, universal, and inherent rights. These are rights that are simply existing because of the agreement, because the nobility in England and King John of England reached this agreement, right? But we have that conception, and that conception merges, and of course I'm simplifying things, the book of course goes into more detail. Conception merges with the idea of the image of God as reason, and you have, as a result, the idea that all reasonable creatures, all humans being created in the image of God and thus reasonable, have certain rights, have certain dimensions which cannot be infringed upon.
Well, let's sit with that for a minute with the all reasonable creatures, because one of the things that emerges from saying that it is one's reason that makes oneself a reflection of the image of God and therefore worthy of certain rights is that it can sometimes lead to some discussions about which humans indeed are capable of reason and therefore might be image. At some point in the recent past, listening to some Christian podcasts, I came across the term image bearers, which I actually love as a term for talking about other human beings, because it actually gets you to interact with other human beings pretty differently if you think about them as image bearers. I know it's not a particularly Jewish way to speak, but I actually really love it, just thinking about human beings as image bearers. But if every image bearer is entitled to certain, let's call them rights, then one of the things you do is you decide who is capable of the reason that makes them an image bearer.
Of course. The minute the Pope writes something like this, and so he writes this in the 13th century, in the 15th and certainly 16th century, we already encounter a lot of heretics, pagans, which have a lot of gold, right? With the Portuguese and the Spaniards coming into South America. What do we do with them, right? And this is exactly your point. One of the ways in which Christians excuse themselves of respecting these people's rights, or what we would call rights, is saying that actually they're not human, right? Actually, they're not reasonable. So either they're not human or not reasonable. These are two different ways of and thus we can do whatever we want from them. I can give an unfortunate but close example. Christopher Columbus, landing in one of his expeditions in what is today Puerto Rico, forbade the missionaries that came with him on his ships to Christianize the indigenous people in what is today Puerto Rico, because baptizing them would be admitting that they are human, they have souls, right? And he didn't want to admit that in order for him to be able to massacre them and take all their property. But again, this again shows that already there was this sensibility, there was this idea that if indeed they are human and are created in the image of God, we cannot simply do what we would like with them. This already is, this is progression. This already is something that is that we shouldn't take as obvious at all. That there was this understanding that actually we can't harm humans being humans.
So the nobility of universal ideals sometimes a little bit fails in translation. At one point in reading this, I was thinking about it's the later development, but all the 19th century science that's devoted to craniometry and measuring people's skulls and deciding what people's intellectual capacity is based on the volume of their crania. And shockingly enough, the white male scientists who do this work decide that both women and black people are less intelligent than the white men, which if not directly a product of this, seems to be a product of who is capable of reason and therefore who's entitled to the rights that flow from having reason. And since you have less reason, it stands to reason that you have fewer rights. Which in one sense is part of a universalizing, we grant that anybody who is capable of reason should have certain rights, but doesn't actually seem, and this I think gets back to what I raised earlier, the question of if these are just ideas that are deployed in the service of what I was going to do anyway, somehow the universalizing idea never forces me to be more universal than I was otherwise inclined to be.
It doesn't never force.
Okay.
But I will say this. Look, first of all, every idea can be manipulated, and humans are masters of manipulation of ideas in order to get their way, to do what they want, etc. First of all, I will even say more than that. I mean, let's say, again, I go to that Pope Innocent IV, 13th century, which recognizes what we would call rights universally, okay? Is the Catholic Church liberal in the 13th century? Of course not. It's not even liberal in the 19th century. It's not really totally liberal even in the 20th and 21st century, okay? But I think what we need to understand, I think, is that thinking that your group is superior to other groups, thinking that your people are entitled to certain things that others are not, that they are superior than others, that they're chosen in different ways, this is basically the default position of humanity, right? People think their group is better than others, and they are better than others, and they deserve better than others, etc. This is all over humanity. Having an idea that this is actually not true, that there is inherent equality between everybody, that there is inherent worth within every human being, no matter what, this is novel and indeed revolutionary, and it influences humanity. It influences humanity very slowly and with many difficulties, right? Again, people will manipulate it in order to get their way. And it needs a lot of other conditions, material conditions for one, but different social conditions, in order for this to be to ripen into what we call the liberal order. And this happens slowly, but I will say not surely at all. It's not deterministic at all. It could not happen, but it happens because this idea has immense force, specifically for people who are religious, by the way, and who do believe that, if it's written that people were created in the image of God, it must mean something to us being believers in that same God, right? It has influence that slowly builds up and, given the right conditions, produces what we call the liberal order.
A number of years ago, I was working with an organization called Civic Spirit, which works to bring citizenship education into religious schools, something else that often gets read as a conservative project, even though I would argue that citizenship education is anything but. And so it was a group of Jewish educators, people who work in Jewish schools, and a group of Catholic educators, people who work in Catholic schools, and our religious differences were the smallest differences between us. The racial and socioeconomic class differences between our schools were vast, and it was a really fascinating encounter. And at some point, this would have been around 2017, give or take, the educators from the Jewish schools were doing a lot of hand-wringing about the Declaration of Independence. And what do we do with these beautiful words of liberty and freedom, penned by a person who owned people as property, into a society in which human beings could be owned as chattel? And what do you do with these words? And we're all being hand-wringy about our discomfort with the words of the Declaration. And it was a teacher named Petrus Fortune, a black man who teaches at a Catholic school in Brooklyn, who said, that's not what I tell my kids. I don't tell my kids some kind of hand-wringing about the flawed promises. I say to my kids, Thomas Jefferson gave you these words. And even if he didn't mean them, and even if he didn't live them out perfectly, they're there for you to take, to pick up and run with them and make them yours. And it was actually interesting to see that we, the white Jewish educators, were so conflicted and so not sure what to do with it. And he, the black Catholic educator teaching a Catholic school class full of first-generation immigrants and people of color, was very sure what to do with it, which is to say, these promises belong to you, take them and run with them.
Yeah, I actually think totally that Thomas Jefferson meant these words. Yes, he was a little hypocritical. Yeah. But I wouldn't be sure that any of us living in the 18th century would not have acted the same or less than Thomas Jefferson. I mean, I actually, look, first of all, anywhere that there is culture, there is hypocrisy. Anywhere that there is morality, there is hypocrisy. Barbarians are not hypocritical. They don't need to be. They don't aspire to anything. They don't have pretensions about anything. So obviously they can't fail these pretensions or aspirations. We can because we do, right? Now, I don't want to, I simply have a beef with that sort of, this looking down upon these figures, because I really don't think that we are better than them. And if I'm allowed one example, I think, you Google up what the metal cobalt does in your cell phone. Basically, the cell phone doesn't work without cobalt, and where we get cobalt. Okay, we get it from Africa. Google it up. Okay, and after you Google it up, ask yourself if you still want to use your cell phone, having it made by atrocious procedures. Okay, I think you will all keep your cell phone. So again, I'm not excusing, obviously, I'm not legitimizing, obviously, slavery or anything like that. But I think we are all, we're all tested in many different ways and sometimes fail.
I would just say that was not a conversation about how one approaches Jefferson. It was a question about what one does with the Declaration, which, after all, is a statement of precisely this idea, right? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. It is very much explicitly a statement of a belief that human beings are.
And by the way, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Of course, these truths aren't self-evident, and they were not self-evident for most of history, for most of humanity, in most places. It's actually an amazing thing to say that people are created equal and they are endowed with inalienable rights. And it's an amazing thing to base a republic that you are establishing on, right? And again, it's an aspiration. Yes, people are hypocritical and not always fulfill this aspiration, but it's an amazing thing to aspire to. And by the way, it's also a sort of a signpost that you can point to and say, are we living up to it? This is, by the way, what Martin Luther King did, right? He would go. This is part of his approach, was to say, there's this uncashed check
Right.
that you gave, and please fulfill it, right? And I think this method works, by the way, and certainly more if you contrast it with a method, the method of someone like Malcolm X, which said, you're all simply hypocritical and I don't want anything to do with you. And blacks need to have their own country and we need to separate from you guys, right? Okay.
I mean, I think it's also a contrast to a politics that is practiced now that says, I don't need to pretend or aspire to certain virtues. I'm not bothering with the hypocrisy. I'll be very frank about my lack of virtues. And then you say, oh, that was the value in feeling the need to hypocritically pretend or profess virtues you don't actually have. It turns out that when you decide to stop professing or pretending, we find ourselves in a rather worse place.
Yeah, but Trump is very authentic, right? But if that's what that's what you like, okay, great.
So since we're going there,
are we? Okay.
Well, I used to go into a conversation about contemporary, where we are right now. I would say that both in the United States and in Israel, people who publicly profess the most devout religious views are not seen as the ones who are also, would that it were the case that those who publicly profess the most devout religious views and most intense religious practices were also the ones who acted on a recognition of the image of God in every person. I don't know that that's how, I will speak for myself, it's not particularly how I experience American or Israeli politics. There seems at some point to have been a divergence between the public profession of faith and being a person of faith and the public actions in ways that recognize the divine image in every human being. Is that about some kind of evolution in organized religion? Is that simply about the mobilization of religion into politics in our particular time in its particular ways? It doesn't say anything, bigger about the realm of ideas. It just speaks about the electoral realities of right now. How do you look at it and understand that?
I actually will go back to what I just said and use the word authenticity. I think a lot of religious people today want to be authentic in their religion, want to have an authentic version of their tradition. And the tragedy is, ironically, that we live in because we live in a time in which some of the founding ideas of our tradition, and I'm talking about Judaism and Christianity, have become totally hegemonic and totally consensual, right? Rights, equality. Because these ideas are so prevalent today, to be an authentic Jew or Christian, you need to reject them to separate yourself from the secular world. The secular world today is a secular translation of these values, of the values of Genesis chapter A, right, and further on. And in order for you to feel that you are authentically religious, you reject them, right? That's the tragedy, I think, right? And again, by the way, obviously we know that our traditions have other voices also, right? Certainly Judaism has other voices, has voices of ethnocentrism, racism, right, and etc. But and of course these people will say, "Oh, we are simply holding these other voices, or these voices which are the authentic voices of our tradition." And again, I would say, first of all, that even I'm not saying that these voices don't exist, but of course other voices do exist. And it's always a choice. It's always a choice we make. And even our very tradition talks about this, right? Yesharim darchei Hashem, tzadikim yalchu b'hem, reshaim yikashlu b'hem, right? Righteous are the ways of the Lord. Righteous people will walk them or carry on with them, and evil people will fail through them. So the same Torah can be or to quote Yoma, I think, sam chaim or sam mavet, right? A poison or medicine.
I don't know if you are, if it's quite made its way to your shores, but there's a discussion in certain segments of the Christian right now of what they call toxic empathy. And the idea that there is an affliction in our society now of people who are too empathetic. Or
Amazing. And this is an inner Christian argument right now. It's unbelievable.
I mean, again, a particular kind of American Protestant Christianity with their particular political valence, but the idea is you've become too squishy and overly empathetic. It's actually also very often connected both to gender, you've become too feminized, and to a kind of anti-Semitic undertone of you've become too Judaized, and a sort of muscular, assertive Christianity won't. But anyway, that's
because we have the mirror image in Israel with Jews saying you've become Christianized, you've become passive. You're turning the other cheek. Of course, we need to return to a militant, manly, violent Judaism, which is the authentic way to be a Jew.
So as long as we've gotten the gender pieces of it, the religion pieces can flip. And then maybe we'll go back to something that you had mentioned much earlier, in which you said that engaging with this can offer another approach to a question that's been asked many times, which is why the West? And that's a question that feels, loaded, maybe even hot potato to engage or to answer. So what is your not loaded, not hot potato answer to?
It may be loaded in hot potato, but I actually want to acknowledge that the West has brought to humanity some very valuable treasures, right? If to be apologetic, right? I've spent 2 years of my life, more than 2 years of my life in India. I love the Hindu culture, and so I definitely don't think that the Western culture is the best or the truth or anything like that. But I do think that Western culture, as I just said, has brought to humanity certain ideas that we should cherish and we should protect, and we should acknowledge the value of the idea that all people are equal, that there are rights, that they need to be protected. These are amazing ideas, and I think it's not by accident that the liberal order developed in the West and not in other places. Again, this is what my book is about, right? Among other things. And it's okay. Now, the liberal order also comes with prices, also comes with drawbacks, obviously, right? And we can talk about that also. But and which other cultures might not have, might have solutions for, might have aspects which complement in a positive way. Fantastic, right? But it's true that Western culture has succeeded in this area, and I think it should be not, first of all, acknowledged and also celebrated.
I think the question of why the West and the reason why it's often hot potato is because I don't think it's just understood as what has the West contributed in the realm of ideas, or even why is the West the place that originated the liberal order. I think that question is often understood as why did the West succeed in dominating, or the global North succeed in dominating the global South?
We can say that.
Jared Diamond is one example of a set of answers to that, and I think
but Jared Diamond, by the way, is a cop-out. Jared Diamond takes these questions and says, you know what made Europe special? It's the geographical situation, the longitude and latitude lines in which Europe is positioned, which allowed it to carry merchandise here and there, and they have this asset. This is a question that basically explains away. This is an answer that explains away the question and says, look, it's chance. They were in the right geographical place. I don't think, first of all, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the right answer. And I want to actually to emphasize another answer, which is ideas made the West. Ideas make history. Ideas turn different cultures in different directions. And yes, if we are asking, why has the West become dominant, become hegemonic in today's world? Yes, it's because these ideas. the idea of individualism, the idea of autonomy, which incentivizes people to compete with each other, maybe good or bad, right? To develop, to invent things, to have initiative in different areas, and to produce capitalism, which, yes, makes for successful technological society, which can dominate the world. Yes, that's the thing. We don't even need to interpret it as a good thing necessarily, but that's the process that happens, right? And we all know these stories about how China had gunpowder and printing press, etc., already before the West. Again, why didn't they do with these things what the West did with these things, right? Why didn't they? They didn't have the drive. They didn't have the certain ambition that our culture of individualism produces, good or
I
bad.
don't think that's also a rather crass way of simplifying things. China had a variety of challenges within its culture that had nothing to do with individualism and the suppression thereof.
Okay.
My question, or the thing that I'd want us to explore and think about, is a different question, not about the contrast to China in that sense, but exactly the reason why the West question is a hot potato is because what the West does is not simply go to people and say, I have this lovely idea of liberalism, what do you think about it? The British bring liberalism to India.
That's right.
By the British Navy, and the United States brings whatever it is exactly we've brought to wherever it is with nuclear missiles, and if we are willing to reckon with the body count as part of this, was a famous debate in the New Republic in the early 2000s between Neil Ferguson and, oh my gosh, the Nobel Prize winning economist from Harvard, whose name I'm forgetting. Yes, thank you, Amartya Sen. In which Ferguson is defending colonialism, and Amartya Sen is like, hi, Indian person here, how many millions of us did the British kill in the name of bringing us liberal democracy? And that's a pretty strange
But I'm going to push
project.
back also on that. I mean, I'm not excusing colonialism, and the British did a lot of very, very evil, nasty things in India, but India today is a democracy, not by chance. Not by chance, not because it's a Hindu idea, right? It's because of British colonialism. This is part of their legacy. There are evil parts, there are good parts, right?
Yeah, can you just, can you elaborate on that a little bit, just for a second? Because I think there are lots of scholars who do not view it that way.
No problem. This is my opinion. I think democracies don't pop up by chance. I think separation of powers, rule of law, judicial system that is a check on the executive, all these ideas are ideas that developed in Europe, specifically in Britain, by the way. We owe basically a lot of the liberal order to English Protestant Calvinism, by the way, and Puritanism, etc., right? And this idea developed there, and the British occupying India basically lent these ideas to the educated elite of India.
I don't want to divert too much, but obviously that India was far from the only colonial country, and it didn't happen in other countries.
That's right.
Indians would argue, many Indian people would argue that it's a little more complicated. It's quite a bit.
Oh, of course it is. Of course it is more.
So that's.
I'm not assuming to sum up the matter in half a minute of oral answer, right? Of course, it's much more complicated. Hindu culture did have their own mechanisms that were able to assimilate and incorporate these ideas, which other cultures did not, by the way, right? And this also is a question that we need to investigate. It's an interesting question, but that's the truth. Japan today is a democracy because of U.S. occupation after World War II. That's a fact. It's a fact. It wasn't a democracy until World War II. Was a democracy and it's a successful democracy. Is it good or bad that Japan is a democracy? I think it's good. Is democracy perfect? No. Does it have drawbacks? Yes. Is it better than imperial autocracy? I think yes. Okay. So again, not to excuse colonialism at all, but to say that that these nations didn't also benefit from it, I think that's just not true. I think we need the picture can be complex. We don't need simply to say colonialism is bad, and so all the results of colonialism are bad. Sometimes things are complex. There's good and bad mixed together.
Are we
Should we move to Q&A?
moving to Q&A?
So if we are, I'd like to use the
I
mic
did-
because the audience on Zoom, which won't be able to hear people in the room if we.
I do just want to throw out that one thing I'd like us to come back to, which we don't have to answer now, we can throw out and move to Q&A, is that there seems to be a significant retrenchment right now, a moving away from the ideas, the liberal ideas of Western democracy that seemed, when I was ending elementary school and starting high school and the Berlin Wall was coming down and the Soviet Union was collapsing and it was like, we won, all of our ideas are dominant, everybody agrees that this is the right way to do things.
The end of history.
And things didn't quite turn out that way, not only first because of, the whatever we'll call the 9/11 and post 9/11 era, but then in fact, because many of the countries of the West seem to be moving away from the liberal democracy that you're talking about the evolution of, and that's obviously also not an end point of history. Turns out history doesn't end, but it is the point of history we're in right now, and thinking about how that makes us think about where we are, what light that sheds, where we've been, but we can come back to that if you want to open up the floor for questions and then return to this question of where we are right now.
Yeah.
Can you just share how you feel these ideas have influenced your thinking in recent, what's happening now in Israel?
So how these ideas influence my thinking about what's happening now in Israel? Well, I will say simply, part of the reason I wrote this book is in order to tell my Jewish compatriots that for some of them that are rejecting rights discourse and liberalism and humanism, universal humanism and feminism as things that are totally foreign to Judaism, that they must reject in order, again, to be authentic Jews or to establish a state that is authentically Jewish, right, Israel. Part of the reason I wrote this book was to say these ideas are actually rooted in our tradition. These ideas are not something that is foreign to us, and we actually don't need to reject them, but quite the opposite. So I mean, it's not influenced by the book is influenced by these ideas. Yeah.
A general question, in your book, do you attempt to maintain a continuum of the idea of the Tzelem Elohim Yivra Adam throughout history, or are you prepared to say it surges at certain points and then is covered for a long period of time, perhaps surge again under different conditions?
Okay, so do I, in my book, chart out the course of the idea of the image of God as a continuum, or does it wane and wax, right? I think the book takes different courses and follows that idea in these different vectors. Like I try to look at selfhood, look at meaning, look at conscience, look at freedom and equality, different ideals and values that are informed by this idea and how they develop across certain periods. Also, not the whole, 5,000 years of Western history. So I can't say that either option that you suggested is what I do in the book. I go through to different vectors. And really, I think the attempt to draw a simple, broad picture of the West begins here, ends here, and how that idea plays out is just not something I was capable of. So I really took specific venues. Yes.
So just piggybacking off the question a few minutes ago, I'm just wondering if you said you wrote the book so that people in Israel will understand the roots in Judaism of the concept of Tzelem Elokim, have you engaged with the religious nationalists like the Itamar Ben Gvirs and people like that? What has been, maybe not him, but people like him, what has been the reaction? Because if it's baffling, there's him, and then there's, again, since we tiptoed into the world of US politics, there are people in this country in political power who seem to also dehumanize others. And so, I'm just wondering how, you sort of touched on it earlier that they say, well, maybe some people don't have the same conception of reason, but I'm just wondering what you were hearing back since you wrote this book.
So about reactions from people who disagree with the main idea of the book, and I will just say, I don't really have any dialogue with people like Itamar Ben Gvir, and I'm not trying to convince them, and I'm not trying to convince people here like extreme Christian nationalists who, I don't know, want to end separation of church and state and Christianize, whatever. These people are beyond the audience that I hope the book influences. What I do hope is that the book influences people who are, who are less extreme, and they are open to ideas and open to being convinced and open to the suggestion that actually, again, humanism, feminism, liberalism are parts of our tradition, and we need to embrace them as such.
I've got a question. The liberal order, as we even sensed in the room, sometimes is attacked from left and from right simultaneously. And is it time to redraw the lines? Is it time to reimagine a different kind of set of loyalties that we have that might be different than what we have seen till now or in the past 50 years?
So is it time to redraw the lines of the liberal order as it is in crisis? And I will just say, I think obviously it is. We are in a crisis of the liberal order, and I think I'm optimistic about the future of liberalism, but I think when we emerge on the other side of this crisis, liberalism will be different. And we will have to address the points of the fault lines and the points of weakness within the liberal order. And I can give my opinion. We a little bit, you just, before we went into questions, you a little bit addressed this. There is a sort of irony or perplexity in the fact that since, let's say, 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the liberal order basically is the only game in town, right? Really the only idea of how to organize a thriving, just society. And at the same time, we have come into a serious crisis of the liberal order. And what I would suggest is that this is not because of the failure of liberalism, but actually because its immense success. Liberalism has become so hegemonic and its ideas have become so prevalent and obvious that their weaknesses have become accentuated and underlined. And their weaknesses, in a few words, is that liberalism does not give us meaning, does not give us identity, does not give us community, and indeed is corrosive in certain ways of all these things that we need, that people need. Because in a few words, liberalism basically is founded and maintains the idea of each and every human being as an abstract, autonomous, universal individual, right? We are all inherently, basically, characterless, autonomous, reasonable beings, okay? This idea is extremely powerful in maintaining a society based on rights and equality, etc. But it undercuts other forms, or not other, forms of community and meaning that we need. Let's say religious tradition, right? Liberalism tells you, first of all, it tells you your Jewishness, your Judaism is something that is peripheral, not central to you. Essentially, you're an abstract human. Also, you're Jewish. Great. Right? And many people don't feel themselves that way, right? They think, essentially, I'm Jewish, I'm also a part of humanity. So there's a tension there. Also, liberalism will tell you, as an autonomous individual, if you want to be Jewish, that's fantastic. If you don't want to be Jewish, that's fantastic, right? That's do whatever you want. Do you, right? And for a religious tradition, that's a challenge. That's not the message that a religious tradition says to its members, right? As an Israeli, liberalism tells me, you want to stay in Israel? Fantastic. You don't want to stay in Israel? Fantastic. Relocate, immigrate, fantastic, right? And Zionism doesn't think that it's fantastic if I leave Israel, right? So there's a tension there. Now, again, I don't think this tension is destructive of the whole project. I think this tension can be maintained. Perhaps even it can be fruitful. But it is a tension that we need to address. And when liberalism has, for the last 30 years, become so hegemonic and intensified, this tension also was accentuated. And I think what we see today is a response to that tension.
That's obviously one story. There are two, I'm going to way oversimplify here, right? There's two stories about the crack up of liberalism, and that is one of them. I will say that is, the New York Times op-ed page story of the crack up of liberalism, and David Brooks and Ross Douthat will be happy to tell you that that's why liberalism is cracking up. The other argument, of course, the crack up of liberalism is about people's material needs, about the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few oligarchs, one of whom just bought himself a president, although it didn't turn out as well for him as he thought it was going to. But if you read a series of exposés that ProPublica has published over the past number of years about how wealthy Americans buy themselves tax policy that increases their wealth, it actually, you'll all take up torches and maybe you were going to take up torches and pitchforks anyway, but by the time you read that series of articles, you're all going to be ready to take up torches and pitchforks. Really reading about how America's tax policy gets made can pretty much make a communist out of anybody. And so the other argument about the crack up of liberalism is that it's about material conditions. We watched this particular fight play out of, the 2016 presidential election, right? Was it about economic conditions or was it about racism? It's really that kind of question. Was it about people seeking a certain kind of identity in the MAGA movement, or was it people seeking a recognition that they are living in a society that's dominated by the swamp and someone's promising to drain the swamp? I don't pretend to have answers to any of this.
Wait, I have.
Oh, you have all the answers. That's great. I don't pretend to have answers to any of this. I just think that you will read people with great confidence marshaling data on both sides of this argument and asserting that the data absolutely bears out their particular position on it. And if you think that it's that people need, more religion, bigger families, and to get off their phones and start meeting people in person, or if you think that it's people who need healthcare and affordable housing, those are going to move in many directions. And of course, you are also finding the interesting phenomenon of people finding real world connection and community, those kinds of things that, Russ Douthit or David Brooks would argue they need around volunteering for the campaigns of leftist politicians who are offering to address the material conditions of their lives. So I don't have an answer. I'm a historian. We're very bad at predicting the future. Come back to me in 30 years. I'll tell you which it is. But anyway, so those are I think the two very rough sketching out kind of understandings of the crack up of liberalism in the past generation. But you have the answer. So
No,
share it with
but
us.
I totally agree. These are the two stories, and I will want to say that I think. Certainly material conditions always are influential, always are significant, and the margins of like wealth in today's societies are preposterous. This all is true, of course. But I will direct you to what's happening today in the Scandinavian countries, or in France, which are the best welfare societies we know, right? And in each and every country, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, we have populist parties, right-wing populist parties that have gained enormous strength over the last decade. And it's hard to say that this is because people feel left out of the economy, or people are not getting the services they need, because again, these are the best welfare states. So while material conditions are always important, I think there is something else going on here. Okay, yes, please.
Well, I believe the example you gave may have just proven your point, in which that Denmark is widely considered the exception to the rise of the far right in Europe, and that is because Denmark has some of the strictest immigration and refugee laws in all of Europe, and they have taken in a significantly smaller number of people from Africa and the Middle East in the past 10 years compared to the other countries.
I'm just going to repeat for the Zoom. Denmark is an exception, and coincidentally, Denmark has the strictest immigration laws and have taken the least number of immigrants.
Correlation does not imply causation.
No, of course.
It's widely believed to be the reason, and the current debated British immigration laws are explicitly modeled after Denmark's.
Again, so I want to emphasize, it's a question of identity, and really look at what the rivals of the liberal order today offer their people. Like populist leaders offer identity. Trump, Orban, Netanyahu will say, I will protect your authentic identity against the courts and the elites and academia and the European Union and immigrants. I will protect your Jewish or Hungarian, etc., authentic identity. That's their message, and I think that message works because that's what people are looking for. Okay, someone here wanted to say something.
I was going to ask you you've spoken relatively little about Israel, and we're all relatively, it's this whole conversation, and we're all here, presumably because the situation in Israel causes us great pain. So I was hoping you could just elaborate in any way, and also, is there anything that you see in Israel, because you live there, you're living there right now, but you're there, anything that you can, are there any rays of hope? Because it seems, when I personally, I think it's probably most of us, think about these issues in the context of Israel, it seems it's very depressing. I mean, it doesn't. It's hard to see rays of hope sitting here, other than just the people gathered in this room and however many are on the mailing list.
So about Israel, look. First of all, I really think we need to acknowledge that we are living through an enormous tragedy. The situation is very bad, very, very bad. Not only the 7th of October trauma, but also the war, what the war has produced in Israel, what Israel has done in the war. We're in a very bad situation. Netanyahu and his consolidation of autocratic power. And so I agree that the situation is very depressing and it's hard to see hope. I will say that the hope that I do carry comes from the fact that Israel has an enormous number of unbelievably good people. And we have seen these people in the year before the war going to demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people week after week. And an enormous civic movement was born there. And now these people are now tired because of the war. They're frustrated. They're meyuashim, how do you say?
Demoralized.
Given up,
Demoralized.
given up.
There's another word for it, but anyway. But they're there. They're there. And really, in the end, societies are the sum of their people. And Israel does have a lot of very good people. And I hope they will allow us to prevail. But really, I agree with you that the situation is very, very bad.
And does it feel, I was just to follow, having not read the book, it feel, the narrative that all sides have is that the concept, some of the concepts that I believe I've now learned are in the book, the idea is, the counter-narrative is that these are don't have deep roots in Israel, or even, especially among the 400, probably a million people could be broadly characterized as settlers, but hundreds of thousands of people. But these are, somehow there are other Jewish concepts that swamp.
Wait.
The idea of an individual, sort of the idea that the individual, well, of course, the Arab individuals are meaningless. Their lives are not of value. It just doesn't seem like rooted.
Yeah.
That idea seems the idea that all lives have value.
No, I mean, I would say that most Israelis agree that humans are equal and that most lives have value. I think actually there's a small minority of very extreme settlers and other religious Zionists and Haredi people who don't think that way.
A small minority.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very large number of people.
Let's say it's a large minority.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think frankly, the fact that you're talking about the settlers is almost a distraction from the even more urgent problem, which is the community in which it is explicitly an anathema to their beliefs and on the most inherent foundational level to their identity, which is the Haredim, which are larger in Netanyahu's government than Otzma and those parties, and are likely to have even more, to continue to have that.
We can lump them together for this purpose, I think.
But they're not. They're in opposition to each other politically in many ways.
No, but in terms of this particular issue of the respect for the other.
Look, I'm not arguing with you. There are a lot of people. Yeah, no, there are a lot of people that this is not central to their morality and worldview, and unfortunately today they are in power.
I think one of the things I appreciated about Tamel's writing was really very shortly after October 7th, I think you wrote one of your first Facebook posts basically saying, we're going to have to figure out a political solution for this. There's no war that's going to fix this, and either Israel or someone else is going to have to be in charge of Gaza.
Yeah.
And I think,
by the way, okay.
I think what I would say on the piece of hope is I think there's a lot of despair, but I think maybe piggybacking on what Tomil said about ideas that shape things, I think you can poll people and see that what they think, and they're thinking horrible things right now. Like really a lot of, even in my family, people say genocidal things. But I think people's thoughts change when there is a different vision. And I think, to me, that's the only way to think about this in a hopeful way. That if there's a charismatic, thoughtful idea that can take shape, then people's minds change. But I agree with you that right now, it doesn't feel that way.
But I would say another thing. I totally agree that ideas shape reality, of course. But I will say another thing. Look, I think it's very clear to the world today that the continuation of managing the crisis is not an option, right? Nihul ha-sikhsukh, right, in Hebrew, right? And I think there's going to be enormous pressure, and already is, to divide the land into two states. And I ask you to imagine which next president after Trump either Republican or Democratic will let the situation continue the way it is. I don't think any president will allow this. So also, you know, we're in a very deep hole, but I don't think the world will allow this to continue.
I feel like we're reading Eicha here, and as soon as you get to a pasuk that sounds a little hopeful, you gotta end. Because if you keep going, you're gonna get to Ki Ma'os Ma'astanu Katzafta Aleinu Ad Mo. You're like, no. Hashivenu Adonai Alechem V'Nashuv V'Chadesh Yemenu K'Kedem. We're done here.
Thank you, Rivka. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just break the mic and thank everyone. Thank you again to everyone here and everyone on the Zoom, and especially to Tomer and Rivka for a really wonderful conversation.